Alright, a video on fields. Kind of a semi-response to a Hothliday video, maybe inspired by, you could say, just because it sort of illustrated more clearly, supposedly, in my mind, what is really being talked about and why these words come up. So you have this idea of force and you have this idea of a field that somehow is the carrier for the force. And the real problem is, see, that creates a nice wave matrix, because then you create a medium or an ether, and now you can just perturbate something and all that kind of crap. But the real point is that, yes, physics kind of went with a field thing in terms of bent space. Bent space is essentially a field. It's bent field. It's field space. It's something that does something. Okay, and that causes something, and so it's the cause and effect doesn't require there to be anything elemental, sort of. The element doesn't go from point A to point B. Something else goes from point A to point B. The actual photon doesn't get there. He nudges something, and that nudge goes there and tells something like the photon to pop out of the other end. And we'll call this some sort of field matrix. That is this carrier. And that's why this whole thing of fields comes up, is because they don't have carriers for any of the forces. See, once they bent space and denied the existence of any kind of elemental, energetic force creating gravity, so once they made gravity a non-force, then they're stuck with everything else that's a manifestation of gravity, which would be magnetism and electricity, and the strong and weak nuclear forces, everything that's made out of it. They need something because they don't have any source of the energy. So they have to call things virtual photons or something else and have them travel through some kind of matrix, because they can't make the real thing do it. They can't make something leave the magnet and arrive somewhere, because then they'd have to account for a conservation problem. Because then they have to explain how they lost something. Something left, and they can't explain it because obviously something doesn't leave. So the magnetism argument is probably the best way to illustrate it. Is that, my argument is magnetism is a consequence of the gravitational field just being filtered by the magnet. And so the energy, the tons, the things, are coming from all the stuff, the little bits, okay, that are making gravity. And those little bits are real tons, and they have real trajectories and go real places. And when they get filtered through the magnet, they're real things. And so now they can come in and they can leave, and there's no conservation problem. So they don't have to ever become virtual. And so you only need a field when you have something called a force, and you can't account for it. You can't explain where it came from. You can't find its mother, its origin, and you can't afford to turn it into active, real energy, because then you have to account for it. You have to explain, well, did the magnet get lighter as it was emanating all of this force? The other point would be is that because they don't have a ton, because they don't have a thing that's actually causing all of the pressure, all of the interactions. They have to create a field so they can just say the force exists, because they can just put the force in the field and say, there, it's in the field. So it's just a way of making they can't, the only time they have a field is when they need one, essentially, right? The only time the field exists is when they need to account for a force that's in it. So it's when the magnet's producing the force, well, we need an electromagnetic force field so the magnetism, because the magnetism obviously exists, so we need a field now to make it happen. But then we don't need the field when we don't have a force to account for. So when there isn't any birds in the sky, you don't need the sky. That's how silly it is. They just put the field there when they need it, okay, when they need to account for a force. So even when Hothliday uses this vector space stuff, or whatever the hell it is, this idea of slotting things with numbers, well, you only need to slot things with numbers when you have numbers that mean something. When all the numbers are zero, yeah, you don't need the field anymore. It's only when you have a force in the field. It's only when you have a ton in it oh, now I need the field, because I can't get the ton from here to there unless I make this whole field for it to get from one place to another and through. So that's the only time they need it, is when they actually have a force to account for. Otherwise, no. You can just evacuate take all the oxygen, everything out of the atmosphere, because there's no birds, so hell with it. We don't need it. And that's how they're just contriving these fields, because they need them to account for the existence of the force. Because otherwise they'd have to say, well, where are those birds coming from? If they don't make the birds just little dots in the atmosphere, if they're real, yeah, and they're coming right for them, this whole field thing just breaks down. So it's kind of a, I mean, all the language, unfortunately, all the language everywhere is broken. There's just so many words that are just not properly defined. And the concept of field is broken in the sense that there is a real quality of fieldness when you have a bulk of something. So if I have a radio tower and it's producing gazillions of these, photons at very long wavelengths, meters distance from each other, and just waves of them. Well, the idea of that being ripples in a field is certainly something you can visualize it that way. You can visualize it as a vibration, woo, 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 and that's very field-like. But it clearly is just real energy. These are real elemental particles, and they really move from one place to another. Now, whether they have any, the deeper argument would be whether they're just in a changed configuration or whether they're actually more tons or something. So my argument would be is they're not something more, they're just something filtered out of what is. What stuff that was the gravitational noise, and they're just an organization of some of that noise. So they're not really extra, they're just ordered. So now they've been colored, so to speak. And so a certain row of birds are white birds, and then there's a row of, the rest of them are all black and white, and then there's pure white, and there's black and white and pure white, that kind of a thing. And so if you saw that coming, you'd say it's a wave coming, and you'd think about a wave of blowing wheat or something, but it's really not. It's just an order. It's just a little bit of complexification in a bunch of uncomplicated, or it's a bunch of segregated, or how you want to look at it. It's ordered. It has a continuity. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a sea of 17, 22, 96, 47. A bunch of incoherency and it's a little bit of coherency in the middle of the incoherency. So I don't know if there's much else to say. So the idea that you need this thing is bogus. There's no need to make this complex mechanism to transmit something, for a photon to bang into it over here, force the field to vibrate, and then for it to pop a new photon out over here. You don't need any of this mechanism. And certainly they've contrived some utility to it, I suppose, in the whole idea of their two-slit experiment and such, where they can now take something that's not a real thing, they can turn everything into a non-real, make it do all kinds of funny stuff, and then have it land as the little bit at the other end. So this is very, they're comfortable doing that, but that comfort shouldn't fool them into essentially falsifying the mechanism, because there's just, you don't create unnecessary complexity in any model without good reason. The default assumption, the sensible default, would be to assume simpler, not more complicated. And unless you have reason to believe otherwise, you shouldn't go there. And I would argue they really don't have reason now, except, well, first they've closed the entire door by putting essentially all of the force, everything that originates all of the forces, into bent space, and so they lost the energy that makes magnetism. They lost the thing that makes even photons. They can't even account for photons in a sense, because they're not recognizing that there is external energy that's actually part of their creation. It accounts for them. Photons aren't really part of real matter. When you're assessing the weight of something, if you were to do it just by particle, you're not going to be weighing the force in between the atoms. And it's the interesting question is how much of their weighing, of gaining a knowledge of our atomic weight, is based on the force trapped between those particles. We might be much lighter than people think if you take the force out, because essentially you're weighing the force. My mass has everything to do with the pressure between my electrons and protons, not, and I mean pressure between proton and electron. That pressure has more to do with what I weigh than the actual tons. But that's another subject. It's not very field-like. But the point is the field in the sense of the bulk of energy, the ton field, if you want to call it that. The birds are the real thing. What they're flying through, who cares? They don't need anything to fly through. I guess that's the point. The force doesn't need a field. The force is real stuff, and it doesn't need a field. It can go from point A to point B. It can arrive, and it can go to another location, just like you can walk somewhere. The force goes somewhere. The actual force, not a vibration of the force. Alright, that's probably enough. So it goes back to the wave stuff in the sense that you agitate water here, and the water molecules that hit your hand here won't be the same ones you agitated here. They're just going to be representative of what happened here. They're just going to have the same movement. They're going to dance the same dance as the ones here, but they're not the same water molecules. But that mechanism, again, like I said, is just so much more complex, and it would be kind of silly to say the mechanism underneath that is even more complex or equally complex. And it's just, I guess the key word is it's unnecessary. And the only reason why there's a conversation about fields is because they didn't account for the existence of the force, because it's invisible. You can't see magnetism. You can't even see most of the photons. Most of the photons are invisible. They hit you right in the eye and you don't see them. And that's what makes it difficult for people to understand, but they're just as real as the visible light ones. The infrared ones, the ultraviolet ones, they're all just as real as the invisible ones. And they go from point A to point B at the speed of light, and so does gravity, and so does magnetism, and so does the nuclear forces. Okay, that's probably enough on fields. So I'll leave a link below to Hothliday's video, I guess.